This is Brad Keithley, Managing Director of Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. Welcome to the weekly Top 3, the top 3 things on our mind here at Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets for the week of August 17th, 2026. The weekly Top 3 is a regular segment on The Michael Dukes Show. The show broadcasts on both Facebook Live and YouTube Live, as well as via streaming audio from the show's website, weekdays from 6 to 8 a.m. I join Michael weekly in the first hour of Tuesday's show from 6:10 to 7 a.m. for a discussion between the two of us about our 3 issues. We post the podcast of our discussion following the show on the Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets Facebook, YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, and Substack pages, also on the Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets website, as well as the projects page on national blog site, medium.com. You can find past episodes of the weekly Top 3 also at the same locations. Keep in mind that in addition to these podcasts, during the week, you can also follow and participate in the discussion with us of these and other issues affecting Alaska's fiscal and economic condition by following us on the Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets Facebook page and through our posts on Twitter. This week, our top 3 issues are these. First, we discuss why, from our perspective, we haven't seen any fiscally conservative candidates in this election cycle. Second, we discuss what really undermined finalizing in the most recent special session, the legislation needed to support the Alaska LNG project. And third, we explain why the industry numbers support our concern that the Alaska Permanent Fund Corporation is not generating as much in earnings as it could be. And now, let's join Michael.
Today is primary day, Brad, and we're going to start off with the weekly top 3. We're going to start off with the first one. It's time to face reality. There's no conservative candidates, really. I mean, there's conservatives, but there's not fiscal conservatives. And you actually put up a whole thing on the chart of the week that basically said who I'm not voting for. What do you mean by this? What's going on, Brad?
Well, Michael, this may have been the most frustrating campaign season that I've ever come across. I mean, I focus on fiscal conservatives and people who are really setting up the budget to be disciplined and setting up the budget to be fair. When you look at revenue sources. And I've looked across all of the 17 gubernatorial candidates. I've looked across all of the however many legislative candidates there are. And I can't find a true fiscal conservative candidate in the bunch of them. And let me explain why. We've got a bunch of them who claim to be fiscal conservatives, and they say spending cuts only. Start with the basics. We have a $1.9 billion deficit. About 35% of the budget is deficit spending that we're pulling revenues from someplace. And so when you start with that premise, we have a bunch of candidates who say spending cuts only. That's not realistic. It's not realistic to think we're going to cut the budget by 35%. Dunleavy didn't even get close in 2019 to trying to cut at that level.
Is it 7%? 7% or maybe 8% on the outside is what he was looking for?
Yeah, he didn't even get close to that. And we saw the pushback that happened when he tried to cut what he tried to cut. He couldn't even get 16 in the legislature to back him up on the degree of cuts that he was calling for. And we are way beyond that now in terms of what spending cuts only would achieve. So we've got a bunch who say spending cuts only. It's not realistic. And all that means is continued PFD cuts, because we won't achieve the spending cuts. There won't be any alternative revenues, broad-based revenues, and so we'll just continue with PFD cuts on down. Those candidates who are saying spending cuts only are really continued PFD cut candidates. Then we have a bunch of candidates who say no taxes. And again, they claim to be fiscal conservatives because they're saying no taxes, no new taxes to deal with this. But you start again with the premise that we got a $1.9 billion deficit, and spending cuts only aren't going to resolve it. So if you have no new taxes, then no broad-based taxes that can be used to substitute for PFD cuts, then what you're left is the same thing the spending cuts only people leave you, which is that we're going to have a huge amount of deficit that's going to continue, that isn't going to be resolved, isn't going to be satisfied through new taxes, and so we're going to continue to use PFD cuts. So the no new taxes people are really just PFD cuts, continued PFD cuts candidates. So what we've really got is a bunch of candidates who are really saying, when you boil down to it, we're just gonna write off the $1.9 billion deficit. We're not going to try to address the deficit. And what we're going to do is we're going to control spending going forward. And we're going to do that through various means. Shelley Hughes has got a long list, and other people have a long list. We're going to control spending going forward, and we're not going to have new taxes to pay for that additional spending. And so that's what we're describing as a fiscal. That's what they're describing themselves as, a fiscal conservative. But they're writing off the $1.9 billion deficit. They're essentially saying, we're not going to try to address that. We're just going to try to control from here on out. The problem with that is two things. One, you still don't have any discipline, any financial discipline to control spending. They think they can do it by fiat. They think they can do it by, the governor vetoing a bunch of stuff. We've seen that works sometimes for Dunleavy, but oftentimes has not worked for Dunleavy. And he's also had what financial people call round heels. I mean, he's bent backwards a lot, and a lot of spending go through that has continued to grow spending. So, people who say we're going to start here and we're going to draw the line, and we're going to write off the $1.9 billion deficit, we're going to draw the line going forward. What taxes would do is create discipline. If you had broad-based taxes, you would suddenly have the top 20% who would be contributing also. You'd have the non-resident industries like fishing and tourism that would be concerned about tax levels that they're not now, because their employees would be subject to taxes in one way or another. You'd have the oil industry, who presumably would pay a portion of the new taxes. You would have them concerned about spending levels. But if you have no new taxes, you don't have that discipline. You're just sort of relying on the veto pen, and that has some influence, but doesn't have a whole lot of influence. The other thing they're missing is they're not looking at the 10-year forecast. And the problem isn't only spending levels going forward. The problem is oil revenues are falling away. Now, people say, we got all these new oil volumes coming in, we'll be fine. Well, no, we aren't. I mean, if you look at the 10-year revenue forecast, because of the way credits are working, because of the way the GBR and other credits are working, oil revenues are going down. And while POMV draws are going up some, they're not going up near enough to offset the impact of the oil revenues, the production tax revenues going down. So when candidates say, I'm a fiscal conservative, I'm going to write off the $1.9 billion, can't do anything about that. I'm a fiscal conservative going forward, I'm going to control spending. That's not enough, because A, you don't have any discipline on the spending, and B, you have revenues falling away from you. So the deficits will increase going forward, even if you held spending constant. The deficits will increase going forward because revenues are falling away, because oil revenues are falling away. So we don't have any candidate, none, in the 17 running for governor and in all of the various candidates running for legislature, none that are addressing those issues. And even the ones who are saying, okay, I'm going to just write off the $1.9 billion. I'm going to be a good legislator, a good fiscally conservative legislator from now on. They're not setting themselves up to be that, because they aren't addressing the revenue fall off, and they aren't working on creating ways to discipline the spending going forward. So as I say, this is probably the most frustrating campaign I've ever been through, because we've got no candidates who truly understands the state's fiscal situation and are truly trying to address the total fiscal situation, including the $1.9 billion deficit that we're facing.
I was trying to analogize this and thinking about, what it's like. And it's like, you've got a budgetary crisis in a household, and the answer is, well, I'll just go get a job doing DoorDash at night I'm going to add extra revenue to my problem. I'm not going to address, because I can't, I'm living a lifestyle that's so built up that I can't just cut it all out without selling the house and doing all this other kind of stuff. So all I'm going to do is try and control it and then get a job at DoorDash and hope that it works out for the best. I mean, I'm trying to analogize it. That falls short, but I mean, that's kind of where we're at. We'll just do it slowly. We'll do it piecemeal, and we'll do it. The problem is that the government economy is growing completely unchecked from the private economy. There is no connectivity. There is no interconnection there. And so people who live in the state are like, oh, it's all great. I mean, I don't, nothing to see here. And yet people who are in the government are like, hey, this is all great. We'll just take all this money. And there's no give and take. There's no back and forth on any of this.
Yeah, I think Rob Myers has hit on it when he talks about the fact that once we started going into the PFD and there were no limits on going into the PFD, you could just, every year you could just make up whatever the heck justification you wanted to make additional PFD cuts. Once we went into the PFD, the legislature completely went off the rails.
Right.
And the legislature completely went off the rails because there was by using PFDs, they shoved all the revenue responsibility to middle and lower income Alaska families. They essentially exempted the top 20%, the non-resident industries and the oil companies, the ones who have the power, the donor class who have the power to push back on spending. They exempted all them by using PFD cuts. They opened up this whole pot of money in terms of PFDs that they could convert to government money through this stealth tax of PFD cuts. And so they're just off on their own. And candidates who think that all I have to do is say that I'm going to control spending and, threaten to use the veto power and all that sort of stuff, they're not dealing in reality. They're not dealing in the reality of what's going on with what the legislature's got, what's coming up with oil, and what it takes to discipline the spending, what it takes to get the donor class engaged in pushing back on spending, as opposed to, at best, from the donor class saying, I don't care because I'm not paying for it. Spend whatever you want. At worst, the donor class saying, oh, yeah, I need more for childcare, or I need more for this, or I need more for that. And being part of the problem, never being part of the solution, but being part of the problem of saying we need more for this and more for that. So there's no candidate and I've looked hard, but there's no candidate who's thought through all this and really put together a game plan for how we truly get the state back on track fiscally. Now, even if you set aside the 1.9 billion, that's gone. Never going to get that back. Even if you set that aside, there's no candidate who really even has a good game plan going forward for how we're going to keep the constraints on from this situation getting, from the standpoint of middle and lower income Alaska families, from the standpoint of those who benefit from PFD. There's no candidate going forward who really has a game plan for how it's going to work out.
Barbara Haney says, people don't win elections on, I'm going to tax you. I mean, it's true. It's true. There's got to be some kind of educational process to explain to people why taxes in that regard are not the end of the world, but potentially a solution to fixing this upside down problem. I mean,
But in effect, people are running on the premise of I'm going to tax you. People are running on I'm going to use PFD cuts as the way. I'm just going to seal off the past and say a $1.9 billion deficit, forget that. And I'm going to use PFD cuts to continually deal with that. And going forward, when they talk about spending, even when they talk about controlling spending, if they're not looking at where the other revenue picture is going, if they're not looking at where oil revenues are going, looking at the 10-year forecast and seeing that dive in oil revenues, they're essentially saying, I'm going to tax you. Even if I'm going to control spending, even if I hold spending flat, which I don't think anybody's saying, but even if I hold spending flat, there's going to be continued deficits and continued taxation through PFD cuts going forward because of what revenues are doing. So candidates are essentially saying that. They're essentially saying, I'm going to tax you. They're not saying it, but the reality is that that's what's going on when they talk about what they are going to do.
Well, because again, none of them, again, very few of them will admit that the PFD is going. I mean, it's going to be gone based on the rate of consumption right now, that the PFD is going away, and that there's going to be a tax on top of that down the road based on the numbers. Very few have ever admitted that on the program, because they just, they can't wrap their brain around that. And that's essentially what we're saying, is that, like you said, you're saying taxes are coming. They're saying it in a subtle way, or admitting it in a subtle way, but the average in the electorate aren't hearing it.
What I'm saying is, from a fiscal reality standpoint, taxes are already here. They've been here for the past 10 years in the form of PFD cuts. We have been paying taxes in the form of PFD cuts for the last 10 years. What a candidate who would have appealed to me would have said, look, we're paying taxes. PFD cuts are taxes on middle income Alaska families. Forget the upper, forget the lower taxes. They are taxes on middle income Alaska families. We're paying taxes. Is there a better way to do this? Yes, there's a better way to do it, and there's a way that puts a significant portion of the burden on non-residents. There's a way to create discipline against additional spending by making sure that all Alaskan families are paying it. They wouldn't say, I'm going to tax you. They would say, we are already paying taxes. We're going to do it in a different, better way going forward. But no one's saying it.
Frank, you got to love Frank. Frank says, well, there you have it. No candidate qualified. Why vote then, Brad? That's the challenge to you. Why vote then?
I don't know, Michael, that I am going to vote. I mean, I just can't. So somebody says, well, who's the best? Who's the best of the worst? And the answer is, there is no best of the worst, because even the candidates who essentially say, forget the $1.9 billion, I'm going to be your candidate going forward, they're not seeing the revenue fall. They're not looking at the 10-year forecast and seeing the revenue fall and taking that into account on how they're going to deal with it. So there is no candidate out there that even when you're asked for the best of the worst, there is no candidate out there.
Right. Brian says, is there a fairer way should be the rhetoric. I mean, that should be the rhetorical. Is there a better way? Is there a fairer way? And I think Brian's right in that regard. And you're right, 100%. We are being taxed already. Harold is parroting something that I've been saying for years. We're the heaviest taxed people on the planet. And it's right. I mean, again, my hypothetical has always been, give Alaskans all the money directly and then tax them back. If you want to see a growth in government stop, give them 100% of the royalties and the revenues and everything else, and then send them the tax bill and see what happens. See how big your government grows. There is no connectivity in that regard. Continuing now, Brad Keithley, Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets, and the weekly top 3. On to number 2. What happened to the special session? What happened to the gas line? What happened to all this? It just seemed to have disappeared, and now they've all gone off to play with their toys somewhere else. Brad, what happened to the third special session?
Michael, I've spent a lot of time thinking about this. I was shocked when Dunleavy threw in the towel. I mean, I just was not anticipating that at all. I mean, maybe we were going to end up in the same place. The legislature wasn't going to do anything different. They were going to readopt the conference committee, or they were just going to go home and say, look, we had the conference proposal out there. If you want it, great. If you don't, then we're just going home. Maybe that's where it was headed anyway, but it just shocked me when Dunleavy threw in the towel. And so I spent a lot of time thinking through what happened. And I think this Friday's column is going to be what happened. And here's my 2 cents about it. The Senate, I mean, a lot of people want to blame the Senate, but the Senate actually adopted, and the conference committee actually adopted what Dunleavy wanted, most of what Dunleavy wanted in terms of changes to the property tax and in terms of changes to other things that they'd previously positioned on, changes to other things that really sort of met the Dunleavy and the Glenfarne objections. And then at the end, and I didn't like this, but at the end, the conference committee also took out the S-Corp fix on Glenfarne. So Glenfarne wasn't even going to get hit by the S-Corp fix. But what happened was Dunleavy then issued after the conference committee came out, Senate passed it, Dunleavy came out and said he was going to veto it. if passed in the current form. And then the House voted 19-19, not press it on. So the change that happened in there after you look through at what the conference committee did to the things that applied to Hillcorp, the change that happened in there was the S corp fix applying to the upstream, applying to Hillcorp and others, and the Hillcorp opposition to that. All right, so I've dug into the Hillcorp opposition. You know, there's a funny thing going on. Hillcorp, even after accounting for the S corp fix, even at full S corp rates, forget Dunleavy's 2%, even at full S corp rates, the 9.4% corporate tax rates, even at that, Hillcorp would make money if the pipeline was built and we had full export volumes. The revenue, the additional revenue, even after accounting expenses, the additional revenue, incremental revenue they would get from selling at full export volumes into the LNG project, the revenue they would get would be greater than the S corp, far greater, significantly greater than the S corp hit. The S corp hit the S corp take both out of the gas line volumes and out of the oil volumes. And so Hillcorp, who claimed, we were going to be paying all this money through the S corp fix, they were actually going to end up with more money. So when they say they weren't going to have as much money to invest, they would have had more money to invest if the bill had passed and we'd had sales at the full export volumes. They would have ended up with more money to invest. And they said, well, we were going to have to surcharge all these gas volumes because we were going to have to get them to pay for the tax. The tax was going to be paid for by the additional volumes they were going to get out of going in to the export volumes. They were going to get, I can't say this enough, and I won't be saying this enough in the column and elsewhere. Hillcorp was going to get more money in their pocket, even with the S corp fix, was going to get more money in their pocket as a result of the passage of the bill, Glen Farm proceeding forward with the project, as long as there were full export volumes. What I think happened was this. I think Hillcorp said to itself, this pipeline's never going to go. We're never going to get full export volumes. And so the S corp fix, what the S corp fix is going to mean to us is what this bill is going to mean with the S corp fix in it. What the S corp fix is going to mean is we're going to have a portion of our current income taken away by the S corp fix on the oil side.
Because it remained whether or not
right.
The gas line went through, the S corp fix was still going to, the S corp provision was still going to be in there.
Right, on the oil side. And so Hillcorp was telling itself, okay, we're going to end up with less money if this bill passes, the S corp fix is put in there, and the gas pipeline never goes through. If the gas pipeline goes through, and if the bill goes through, the gas pipeline, all the fixes that Glen Farm wanted, all of that's fixed, and the gas line goes through, and we hit full export volumes, we're going to make more money. And so the S corp fix is an irritant. I mean, we have to pay a portion of the more money we're going to get. We're going to have to pay a portion of that in taxes, but we're still going to end up with more money on net if all of this goes through. So a rational actor would sit there and say, okay, yeah, I really hate this S corp thing. I'm going to have to pay a portion of the money that I otherwise was going to get in taxes, but I'm going to end up with more money. I'm going to end up with more money to invest if the thing goes through. Rational actor would say, okay, I'm not going to block this bill. But Hillcorp did block the bill. And when you think through this, what I think was motivating them was their belief that there wasn't going to be a pipeline, that we weren't going to hit the export volumes. And so it was going to be a net negative instead of a net positive for them, as it would be if we had the export volumes. It was going to be a net negative to them. And so they used all of these arguments about, we're going to have to add on to gas costs, and we won't have as much money to invest. They used all those arguments to block the bill because they didn't want the S corp fix applying to their existing operations, because they didn't think the pipeline was going to go through. And that's what I think led to this. Ultimately, it's Hillcorp sitting down and saying to itself, penciling it out and saying, this pipeline's never going to go. We're going to end up with the S corp fix. That's going to be a net negative. And so we're going to throw up a bunch of junk. We're going to write this long letter with a bunch of junk in it that throws up a bunch of junk about the S corp, which isn't true if the export volumes go through. But we're going to write this letter with a bunch of junk because we want to kill this bill because we're concerned about the bill passing, applying the S corp tax to us, and the pipeline and the export volumes never go.
Well, let me ask you this: do you think that they were right? I mean, do you think that do you think that it would be tough to get to full export volume? Do you think that they've made the correct prediction here based on your expertise as an oil and gas attorney and all that other kind of stuff? And you look at all these things that were going on. Do you think it would have gotten there?
It's tough. I mean, they don't have the export volumes. Glenfarne doesn't have the export volumes yet. And no one was promising that those additional export volumes they need would come on board if the property tax change was made. They were saying it would be better. We would be closer, but no one was willing to guarantee those volumes were going to come on. And if you look at the global market right now, the global LNG market, you look at all the capacity, the additional capacity that's coming on in the U.S. Gulf Coast, you look at the additional capacity that's coming on the Canadian West Coast. Now there's a project for the Canadian East Coast. If you look at all the projects that are coming on, I think it would be tough for Glenfarne to make the project go. But Hillcorp and others were saying, "Oh, this project's going to go." And the only thing standing in the way of it is the S corp fix. That's not true.
Right.
That's not true. I think they're hedging.
They're hedging their bets because they can say in their public face, we think it's going to go, but privately they're like, this is not going anywhere and it's going to cost us money in the long run. So throw some stuff up there to say it's going to cost us money, it's just not going to work. But I mean, I think privately, this has always been my fear that we were going to get to this point and the whole thing was going to come unstuck because everybody was, living on the hopium that it was actually going to come about.
Yep. But and I'm not trying to take the burden off. I mean, I'm not trying to be partisan. I'm not trying to take the burden off anybody, but to say that the S corp fix was, what was stop the pipeline. For those who go out on the campaign trail or otherwise and say the S corp fix stopped the pipeline, that it's the fault of those who proposed and pushed the S corp fix. I don't think that's right. What I think happened was the conclusion was made by those who would pay the S corp tax. The conclusion was made that the export volumes were never going to go. They were never going to see the additional money that the whole package would give them, and so they decided to cut their losses and hedge their bets, as you say, and try to block the passage of the bill with the S corp fix in it, because of the likelihood in their mind that they were going to end up paying the S corp tax and never get the benefit of the additional volumes.
It seems reasonable. I mean, it seems like they were, again, protecting their shareholders and themselves, which is what they're supposed to do. And we kind of bought into it. The Senate majority has their part to play as well. They were looking for more and more revenue. That's what, because they're all about the revenue now. So this was kind of the perfect storm at this point for all these things to come together to basically saddle Alaskans with, a future economic debacle, because because all these things aligned and came together at the same time.
Yep. I just don't think it's fair, as I've thought through it. I just don't think it's fair to blame this on the S corp fix. I think the S corp fix certainly was an issue that came up that people had to deal with. But if you believed in the pipeline, like a lot of people said they did, that this pipeline's going to, all we need to do is pass this bill, that this pipeline's going to go, and that we're going to have these additional revenues. If you believed that, the S corp fix wasn't a problem, because Hillcorp would have ended up with more money at the end of the day if the pipeline had gone. So it's going to be an interesting story. I've been involved in various projects over my life where, the story after you piece it together is a lot more interesting than the story as it was going on.
Right.
And I think this is going to be one of those situations.
Quickly, 60 seconds here. What do you think happens now? I mean, the governor's kind of thrown in the towel. What's your prediction?
I think we have a campaign that everybody says I'm going to build the line, and we're going to have these volumes, and we're going to go forward and all this stuff, and then they're going to get to December, they're going to have been elected. Whoever survives is going to have been elected, and he's going to go. Sort of like happened in 2014 when the campaign was, don't worry, be happy, we're going to be great. And then oil prices cratered. Or 2018 when Dunleavy said the same thing, and then oil prices cratered. I think we're going to go through a campaign where everybody says, I'm going to build the line. We're going to get to December, and the new governor's going to go, shit, I don't know how I'm going to build this line. I don't know how. I'm not sure how anything like this is going to come together.
Craig said something that I think is very funny. As an oil and gas attorney who's looked at these things and worked through these things and made deals and made these decisions, Craig said something that made me laugh. He said, full export volume is years away. No one makes tax decisions that far out. That's a dumb argument. And all I could think of is, man, they got rooms and floors worth of your sharp penciled accountants who are looking at things just like that, who are doing the math 15 and 20 years down the road to see if a deal pencils out, right? I mean, on known quantities right now. That's not unusual. Am I wrong, Brad?
No, absolutely. You're absolutely right, Michael. In fact, the S Corp, I'm not sure anybody ever focused on this, but one of the fixes that the Senate did before it passed the final bill that it passed out and then was included in the conference committee bill, and the conference committee bill may have lengthened it even more, was to extend the period of time before the S Corp tax took effect, so that it took effect almost at the same time as the full export volumes were supposed to come on board. So that timing fix was to take away the argument that, oh, you're going to make me pay all these taxes before we get to the point where I have additional revenues. No, the fix in the S Corp bill was to push back the effective date so that it timed up to the effectively timed up to the full export volumes. And so what you were looking at when you looked at these bills, you were looking at a situation in which you were going to be subject to the full S Corp tax about at the time you're going to have the full revenues. And so since the full export revenues were going to give you all this revenue, the S Corp tax would be an irritant, but wouldn't be an impediment. And that was intentional. I mean, you could see that structure going on as they lengthened out the effective date, push back the effective date. So absolutely, the accountants in the room and the lawyers in the room and everybody else in the room was focusing on what the economics would look like at that point, not currently, because the S Corp tax wasn't going to take effect currently. At that point that we were supposed to be having that Glenn Farn and others had said we were going to hit full export volumes.
Jeremy Bynum makes a counter argument. He says it is fair to blame the new income tax added to the bill 100%. You don't jam a new tax through a floor amendment in the 11th hour and say it has problems, but we'll fix it later. I mean, and I agree with that in part because, again, there was no process on this. It was just kind of jammed through and take it or leave it kind of thing. So that did cause some more problems. But I think still, to your point, that could have been exacerbated by the fact that Hillcorp believed this thing wasn't going to happen. And so it was eventually going to hurt them in the short term anyway. So that's why they threw up all the roadblocks.
Yeah.
I don't think those two things are mutually exclusive is what I'm saying.
Yeah. And I don't really accept Jeremy's point. I mean, we talked about the S Corp fix for a long time. I think that the nits that people raised about the S Corp tax, Hillcorp and others raised about the S Corp tax, were in fact nits. I mean, I think I've been a lawyer in these situations. Here's a bill. Find 5 things that are wrong with it, and you can always do that in any bill. You can always find 5 things that are wrong about it, 5 things that you can complain about. And I don't think that the things that Hillcorp and others were complaining about the S Corp tax were legitimate. And I think the evidence of that, frankly, is Dunleavy's proposed compromise was to implement the S Corp tax bill at 2% as opposed to the statutory 9.4%, but was to implement that very bill. So if Dunleavy thought there were all these problems with it, implementation problems with it, and imbalance problems with it, and drafting problems with it, he wouldn't have done that, but he did. So I think I just don't accept Jeremy's point that that's a fair issue.
Brad Keithley, Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. I'm just going backwards here to see if there's any other comments here, and see what else people are talking about. That's energy, hydro, and nuclear. Yeah, I mean, I think those are things. Monty Peterson says biggest boondoggle in Alaska history: the Alaska LNG tax line, the Alaska gas LNG line tax bill. I mean, that's the thing. This has always been my fear, right? I was always cautiously optimistic. I was hopeful, but not optimistic, is what I was saying. I was hopeful, but I was not optimistic that we were going to get there. And I think this is where we're at right now. We're reaping that reward, unfortunately, because there's a whole variety of factors. And the Hill Corp tax was one. The attitude of the Senate majority was another. The fact that the Democrats don't want any petroleum-based, contracts to continue is a third. I mean, there's a lot of different things. They all kind of fell together in this one area, and I think that's what we're reaping right now. Brad said a few minutes ago that we've got this declining revenue. That's a big component of our deficit, right? Not only are we overspending, but we've got a declining revenue in the form of oil revenues. Those are continuing to go down. And while some of the draws on the earnings reserve are a little higher, they can't offset the whole thing. Number three is a point in an analysis that even the national numbers are saying that the Permanent Fund Corporation's investment policy is falling way short. And that the state is losing money on it. Brad, what are you saying here?
Well, there was an article in the Wall Street Journal yesterday that triggered me on this. The headline of the article is "Stock Picking Funds Are Performing as Poorly as Ever," and the Journal occasionally does these articles of comparing actively managed investment funds, stock picking funds. That is, they're actively managed, and the managers are trying to pick winners and losers, and bet on the winners, bet on more winners than they do on losers, and reap returns by having expertise in picking the right mix of investments. And the Journal occasionally does a comparison of how those funds are doing, the actively managed funds are doing, against the passive funds. And the passive funds are generally those that are invested in exchange traded funds, ETFs, and you set the fund, you set your investment in that fund, and then you rise or fall based upon how the stocks in that fund, that index does. And what the Journal has increasingly focused on over the recent past is the poor performance of the actively managed funds. They're still making money, but the poor performance of the actively managed funds compared to the passive funds, the ETF based funds. And this headline is its most recent analysis of that. The headline is "Stock Picking Funds, Actively Managed Funds, essentially, are performing as poorly as ever." And the subheadline is "Just 13% of U.S. large cap funds, actively managed funds, have outperformed indices over the past decade." New data show just 13% of these actively managed funds that are focused on large caps are doing better than just investing the money in an ETF, in a passive investment in an ETF, and letting it go. And that's the number for the large caps. But the article goes through and it talks about funds that focus on different other investment categories in addition to large caps. And again, they're all doing more poorly compared to the ETFs. Again, the actively managed funds are making money. They're just not making as much money as would be made if you put it in the ETFs. We have our own experience in Alaska. Michael, if you'll throw that chart up. So this is a chart we've talked about before. We'll be talking about again over the years. It is a comparison of the returns earned by the Permanent Fund Corporation on the left-hand side, the numbers under Permanent Fund, compared to the Vanguard the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF, which is one of the ETF funds, And then compared to other things, but over on the right side is the passive index benchmark. And that is a benchmark calculated or put together by the Permanent Fund Corporation itself that says how would we be doing if we just invested in these ETFs, if we made passive investments as opposed to actively investing the funds, actively managing the funds. And a big difference between the passive index benchmarks and the actively managed fund, which is the actively managed funds, which includes the permanent fund on the left-hand side. The big difference between those two is the amount of fees you're paying. Because when you actively manage, you got to pay a bunch of fees out to the managers and to the people who are putting together the investments that the managers are choosing. On the ETF side, you're just really paying for a computer program that's following these indices. And so the passive index funds are really low cost, almost negligible cost compared to what you're putting out on the actively managed side. And you can see that the experience in Alaska is the same as what the Wall Street Journal is talking about nationally. If you look at the 5-year average, for example, the actively managed fund is doing slightly better, 6.61%. The permanent fund's actively managed fund, 6.61%, compared to the passive index that they've put together of 6.45%. If you want to see the comparison to the ultimate passive index, it'd be comparing it to the Vanguard 500, which has earned over the last 5 years an average of 13.38%. But you can see that even when you look at it on a 5-year average, which is heavily weighted by years before the earlier years in that 5-year average, that the passive index benchmark, the permanent fund's passive index benchmark, is almost matching what its actively managed benchmark is. And then when you look at the 3-year, the 3-year passive index benchmark put together by the permanent fund is 13.76 compared to 9.84 from the actively managed side. And then from the rolling 12-month average, the passive index is 16.24 for the passive index management or passive index fund benchmark compared to the permanent fund's actively managed 12.42%. So we're seeing in Alaska with the Permanent Fund Corporation the same thing that the Wall Street Journal is pointing out is going on nationally with respect to the comparison of the actively managed versus the passive funds. And we know that the Permanent Fund Corporation is paying a huge amount in fees, $1 billion, nearly $1 billion a year in fees for this actively managed fund that's producing lower returns than the passive index fund, and much less than if the permanent fund had been following the S&P 500. We're just seeing an example. So again, as the Wall Street Journal points out with respect to at a national level, it's not that the actively managed funds aren't making money. They are, but they aren't making as much by paying all these fees and by trying to pick winners and losers. By doing that, they're making less money, a lot less money than they would if they were engaged in following down the passive investment road. And we're seeing the same thing in Alaska. The permanent fund's making money. I'm not here to claim, and I don't think anybody's here to claim, that the Permanent Fund Corporation is not making money on its investments. It's not making as much, though, as it would if it were following the passive benchmark or the passive index route. And that's a problem. I mean, when you look out at the revenues, Michael is exactly right at the beginning of this. When you look out at the revenues, oil revenues are going down. We need something to offset that. And the permanent fund earnings would be a very good place to have additional earnings. And the opportunities out there when you start looking at what's going on with these passive index funds, the opportunities out there to make more by leaving that on the table, by not pursuing the sort of strategy that produces the best returns, by leaving that on the table, we're leaving money on the table. Alaska's leaving money on the table.
Yeah, and a big amount. And again, we're paying $1 billion a year to get these poorer returns than if we just pegged it to the Vanguard or some other high speed ETF. I mean, we're already doing it. But their argument is, well, we needed more stability, and we want. But again, $1 billion a year. The Harvard Fund is getting a much better return, and it costs them $200,000 a year for the same kind of thing. I mean, this is and who's talking about this? Almost nobody is talking about this, Brad.
Yep. No, it's not been an issue on the campaign trail. I don't think people understand it. I don't think the candidates have taken the time to understand it, which is another point on why we have no fiscally conservative candidates. If we had fiscally conservative candidates, they would pay attention to the revenue side as well as to the spending side. They would talk about constraining spending, as a lot of our candidates do, but they would also pay attention to the revenue side and saying, can we do better on the revenue side? And I don't think we have any candidates who are doing that on the revenue side.
Final thoughts, Brad, quickly, 20 seconds for Election Day.
I'm just depressed. I mean, I can't. I just, I've there's still a little bit longer, but I just can't. I just don't see a candidate out there that's going to meet is truly leading the state in the right direction. Maybe we'll see changes when we get to the Final Four.
Yeah. Well, maybe that's it. Maybe there's a strategy change when we come to the general versus the primary. We'll have to see. I'm with you. I'm just kind of like, there are things that I like about certain candidates. They're personality wise, I like a lot of them, but I'm just not seeing anybody who's reaching up there and screaming from the rooftops and talking about the things that you and I talk about. And if we're not going to talk about the things that are actually going to fix it, in both the short term and the long term, we're just not going to come out of it. It's not going to make a difference. We'll be here 4 years from now in the next gubernatorial election, and we'll be having exactly the same conversations.
Yeah, I can see a governor like about a year in saying, well, I've restrained spending. I can see one of these candidates saying, about a year in, I've restrained spending, but the deficits are growing. I just didn't see that coming. I just didn't see revenues falling through the floor. Well, what that means is they didn't look at the 10-year plan. I mean, you can see that sitting in the 10-year plan right now. It doesn't take a rocket scientist. It doesn't take somebody with a big head or a seer into the future. It's right there in the revenue forecast, in the spring revenue forecast, that and it's been there for a long time. That the oil revenues are falling off, and that they aren't being matched. That even though the POMV draws are growing, they aren't being matched by the revenue fall off that's going on the oil side. So it's not. I mean, it's that the candidates, they can talk about spending all they want. They can talk about how they're going to control spending, how they're going to have all of these sunset commissions and everything else. They can talk about spending all they want, but if they're not paying attention to the revenue side, they're not going to get the state to anywhere near the balanced fiscal plan that they claim they are. I mean, we have social conservatives out there. If what drives you is social conservatism, social issues, then we have plenty of candidates on the who are conservative on the social side. But for candidates to claim that I'm socially conservative, therefore I'm fiscally conservative, it's not true. They're not fiscally conservative.
Rob's talked about that a lot, that Alaska is a socially red state, but fiscally and everything else, we're blue. I mean, we're always looking to the government to solve what. I mean, look at the people who are pushing it more than anything else, like this childcare thing. We're all supposedly number crunching fiscal conservatives. I mean, that was what Julie Colon, that was her claim to fame, was that she was a number cruncher, getting in on there in the budget and trying to fix things. And yet she was the one that was championing $7-8 million being paid into childcare. It's, the socially conservative, yes. Fiscally conservative, that's a whole different critter. Again, they are not tied at the hip.
Yeah. And I think, Michael, what frustrates me more than anything is nobody is even trying to deal with the 1.9 billion deficit. No one's even trying to balance that out. It's just I can do better going forward, and we'll just sort of seal off that past as a horrible past, and I can do better from this point forward. Well, yeah, you can't, because you're not taking into account what's going on the revenue side, and the continued fact that that's going to fade away on us, even with increased volumes, because of the way the oil taxes work in their second decade, that's going to fade away on us. They're not dealing with that, and they're just, it's just we're not going to get to a balanced budget based upon the claims that any of these candidates are making, either at the gubernatorial level or at the legislative level.
It's and I'm with you. I'm frustrated. I'm frustrated. It doesn't mean that I'm going to stop fighting it. Doesn't mean that I'm going to stop, but it is frustrating when you look at it and you see that nobody wants to acknowledge it. We're going to talk in just a minute here. When we get back to the radio, we're going to talk a little bit about that disconnect and why a lot of the candidates, they don't even really understand. They may pay lip service to it, but they don't really understand it. And they don't especially understand the why of it. And you could see that in their reaction to, oh, well, we'll just do the, I mean, my favorite one to pick on is the Sunset Commission. Okay, it's a great idea. I'm not saying it's not a great idea. I'm saying you've got one commission is going to take on one program or one committee a year. How many years is it going to take? You'll never get caught up. In fact, it will grow faster than you can shut it down with that kind of idea. It's a great idea. The thing is, it doesn't go nearly fast enough. It doesn't go nearly the growth, the rate of growth will far exceed anything that it can do. And that's just an example of some of the problems that we have right now.
Yeah. Yeah. And while you're picking on that one commission, revenues, I mean, the problem is going to become greater, not necessarily because of growth in spending, although that will occur because there's no constraints on that. Not only because of the growth in spending, but because of the fall off in revenues. A candidate who is truly focusing on the revenue side, I mean, it's easy pickings. Looking at what the permanent fund is doing compared to the passive index benchmarks, it is easy pickings to say, look, one of the things we need to do is we need to go in and look at what the permanent fund corporation is doing and how they're investing money, and we need to evaluate that because they're falling way short of even their own benchmarks. Not to mention the other benchmarks that are out, the more public benchmarks that are out there that they haven't constructed. That's easy pickings. We need to take that asset and we need to make more. None of the candidates, maybe Josh Church on every 15th day, but none of the candidates are really talking about that as an issue. That's indicative to me. I mean, that's probably the easiest thing out there. That's indicative to me that these candidates aren't taking the revenue side seriously. And they're not trying to understand how to balance out where we are in terms of spending with where we could be in terms of revenue.
Brad Keithley, Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. Enjoy your time out there, my friend. Appreciate it. Hope to see you back soon.
You will, Michael. Thank you. Well, that's a wrap for another week's edition of the weekly top 3 from Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. Thank you again for joining us. Remember that you can find past episodes on our YouTube, SoundCloud, Spotify, and Substack pages, and keep track of us during the week on Facebook and Twitter. This has been Brad Keithley, Managing Director of Alaskans for Sustainable Budgets. We look forward to you joining us again next week for the next edition of the weekly Top 3.